I've changed my position just a little bit, but I'm still strongly in the, oh yeah, this is pretty natural. And yes, if you put enough kids on an island who can stay alive and socialize with each other, you're probably going to get stuff that starts looking religious within at least one generation.
Right.
I hope nobody does that experiment, though. That would be unethical.
Right. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Incisive Thoughts. And today we have something very special for you all. Today we have Dr. Justin Barrett. Dr. Justin Barrett, a leading expert in cognitive science of religion. He's a pioneer in cognitive science of religion. With a PhD in experimental psychology at Cornell University, Dr. Barrett has spent over 2 decades exploring how human cognition shapes religious beliefs. He's an author of influential books like Why Would Anyone Believe in God or Born Believers, and has taught at institutes such as the University of Oxford and Fuller Theology Seminary. As the president of Blueprint, Dr. Barrett continues to bridge science and theology in groundbreaking ways. Beyond his impressive credentials, Dr. Barrett is known for making complex ideas accessible and for his sharp sense of humor. We are thrilled to have him here for what promises to be a fascinating and engaging discussion. So welcome to the stage, Dr. Barrett. How are you doing?
Thank you. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me. Well, with that kind of introduction, the pressure is on.
So the topic of our discussion today is going to be the argument from positive epistemic status. This was an argument I discovered in the book 24 or so arguments for God's existence, and this was a fascinating argument. This argument basically argues for belief in God, which arises naturally from reliable cognitive faculties, help humans understand the world. This naturalness leads prima facie credibility to theistic beliefs, unless compelling reason suggests otherwise. This is a brief summary. Now, I think Dr. Barrett can expand on that. So, Dr. Barrett, can you give us an introduction of what this argument is?
Sure. Yeah, the book you're referencing, 24 or so arguments for God, is it arose out of some lectures and some notes that philosopher Alvin Plantinga put together. That really is about what it says it is. That is, Alvin Plantinga proposed little thumbnail sketches, brief starts of about 24 arguments that he says would give us good reasons for believing in God of some sort. And then the editors of the volume invited a number of us to amplify or discuss some of Alvin Plantinga's arguments. And I was assigned the argument from positive epistemic status. And that sounds very jargony, and it is. He's trying to be very precise there. But I think we can, for our purposes, we can simplify things a little bit. But let me start by just reading Alvin Plantinga's summary of what he means by the argument, and then I'll try to unpack that a little bit for us. So Plantinga wrote, "Clearly, many of our beliefs do have positive epistemic status for us. At any rate, most of us think so. Most of us accept this premise." I'm going to pause. I'm going to pause immediately. What's he mean by positive epistemic status? Without getting too technical, what he's trying to get at there is this idea that some of our ideas are good for us to hold. We're not wrong to have them. They are positive epistemically in the sense that they are justified or rational or warranted true beliefs. They constitute knowledge. These are the kinds of, I used lots of different terms in there because different philosophers use different terms to get at what they're trying to, depending on what their theory is and so forth. But what all of them are trying to point to, and why he can use this term positive epistemic status, is that sometimes we might have true beliefs accidentally, but that doesn't count as knowledge. At least most philosophers would say that doesn't really count. So if we have a true belief, We know if we have a false belief, we shouldn't hold on to it. But if we have a true belief, but we arrived at it the wrong way, maybe there's something missing there. It lacks positive epistemic status. You might, okay, well, what would those types of things be? Well, philosophers love to offer lots of these thought problems, but here's one that I made up for us. So imagine you're going into a dark room and you bang your head really hard just because it's dark, and you run into something and bang your head on a piece of furniture or something, and you bang your head hard enough that you sort of see stars. You ever had that experience where the little twinkly lights around you, right? It does happen. I've done this, or blow to the head. I see little twinkly lights. And on the basis of seeing the little twinkly lights, I conclude that there are fireflies in the room. Are you familiar with fireflies?
Yeah.
So the little bugs that glow and stuff. So yeah. I think there are fireflies in the room. Well, it may turn out that there are fireflies in the room. In fact, there were fireflies in the room, but I wasn't looking at the fireflies when I formed the belief that there were fireflies in the room. I formed the belief that turns out to be true in a way that we really shouldn't trust. So it doesn't have positive epistemic status, even though the belief is true. Okay, so that's trying to warm you up to this idea of positive epistemic status. So clearly, many of our beliefs do have positive epistemic status for us. At any rate, most of us think so. Most of us accept this premise. Okay. As we have seen in his other work, positive epistemic status is best thought of as a matter of a beliefs being produced by cognitive faculties. That's stuff going on in your head that are functioning properly in the sort of environment that is appropriate for them. Okay, and so in my example, the cognitive faculties weren't functioning properly because you'd received a blow to the head, right? But under normal conditions, when our brains are working the way they're supposed to form beliefs in the kinds of environments that they're supposed to form those beliefs, generally we regard the beliefs that they produce as having positive epistemic status. That's what he's getting at. The easiest and most natural way to think of proper functioning of those belief-forming, the belief-forming machinery in our brains, however, he writes, is in terms of design. A machine or an organism is working properly when it's working the way it was designed to work by the being that designed it. But clearly the best candidate for the being who has designed our cognitive faculties, our brains, would be God. Okay, so that's the overview of the argument. And so he's trying to get at this idea that, then to sort of oversimplify it a little bit, if we think that we've got true beliefs, and whether we believe in God or not, we go through life, most of us, thinking that we do have true beliefs, and not just true beliefs, but true beliefs we're sort of entitled to hold, that we're rational to hold those true beliefs. That is, they have positive epistemic status. Almost all of us have that. His argument is, well, look, that makes most sense in terms of your cognitive faculties or your belief-forming faculties of our minds doing what they're supposed to do, form true beliefs in the environments that they're supposed to, and they're working right. That's the way that you get these warranted or justified or whatever kinds of beliefs, these beliefs with positive epistemic status. So if you think you have those kinds of beliefs, and it requires you to have machinery that's working right to form beliefs, well, then it raises this interesting problem of, well, in what sense can you talk about that machinery as having been designed and functioning properly then? Because the idea of a proper function suggests that there's some kind of a design for it. There's a kind of end to the machine, a purpose for it. Well, where does that come from? And Plantinga wants to say that actually it makes most sense to say, well, God put that in our heads. And that's why we can feel confident in these beliefs that have high positive epistemic status. Okay, that was a lot of technical stuff.
Yeah.
I'm happy to give a couple more illustrations to unpack that, but I want to give you a chance to steer me if you need to.
Yeah. So the first question comes to my mind is, well, someone can just start off with the assumption that our cognitive faculties are not designed and they're not functioning properly, and then that would be a defeater for all of their beliefs, wouldn't that be?
That's right. And that's part of the strength of Plantinga's argument. Is one way out is to just say, well, no, I don't think that that our minds are functioning properly for some particular purpose to form true beliefs. Okay, well then it's hard to see why you would believe that,
Hmm.
because that's a belief that you have, and now you don't know that it's a true belief. So it's sort of a self-defeating kind of belief to be skeptical about our cognitive faculties. And so, yeah, almost nobody really, I mean, some philosophers will say, yeah, I'm skeptic. We don't really know anything. But apparently you know that you don't know anything. Well,
Right.
why are you so confident in the belief that you don't know anything?
Hmm.
So something funny is going on there. And
Right.
as regular human beings outside of their philosophical world, you go, really? You don't think you know what you had for dinner last night? Really? Like, oh, no, actually, I think I do remember what I had for dinner last night. You don't think that's a good belief, a belief with positive epistemic status? Of course you do. Of course you do. So stop with the whole, we don't really know anything. Uh,
Right. Oh, just I have some, like, something completely off topic here, but just you just reminded me. One of your conversations I was going through, like, I think it was with Cameron Batuski, and you were explaining how, like, if some people they just rely on scientific truths, like scientific knowledge, and that also questions, like, their, like, what they had for breakfast, they cannot justify just by using science. I just wanted to, like, uh, ask you on how does that work about, if you can explain.
oh, yeah, yeah. So there are some people, fortunately less and less all the time, but there's some people still around who hold up the sciences as the only way that we can learn anything, the only way that we can know anything, or to put it back in Plantinga's language, the only way that we can have beliefs with positive epistemic status. Um, and usually the argument is, it's an argument on the basis of the strength of the sciences. The sciences have been wonderful tools for making lots of great discoveries, but that claim that it's the only way that we can know things on its face is sort of absurd. Um, and I like to help people see that in a couple of ways. One of those is to point out that what we call the sciences actually has only existed for about 500 years. Um, and so if you're really committed to the idea that sciences are the only way we know anything, then before about 500 years ago, nobody knew anything, which
Right.
just seems absurd, right? That nobody knew anything
Right.
until, behold, the sciences. And then suddenly, oh, we finally know something. So there's that. There are, of course, all of these other ways of knowing that, like the study of history, which we don't do scientifically.
Right.
We use other methods. They are often empirical methods. That is, they use observable evidence of various sorts, but they don't just use observable evidence. They draw inferences from those that are not directly out of that evidence. We use testimony. We use the authority of people who have come before us. We use tradition. We have all these other ways of knowing that we generally accept as even in the sciences, we accept, right? We don't do all of the experiments ourselves over again. I trust other scientists to be telling me the truth about the experiments they've run. So it's just not even the way that the sciences work. But then, yes, you picked up on the example of that I like to give people of things like their memory. Do you
Right.
remember what you ate yesterday? You don't have any scientific evidence or empirical evidence for what you ate yesterday. At least I hope you don't. Hopefully you ate that and it's all gone and we don't need to inspect that anymore. But assuming you have not looked at evidence of that sort, you surely you know what you ate yesterday, or at least the beliefs you have about what you ate yesterday are pretty good beliefs to hold, aren't they? Because as a general rule of thumb, we trust our cognitive faculties that give us beliefs, our belief-forming faculties, or BFFs. We trust them unless we have reason to suspect them. So we think that our memory for what we had for dinner last night is accurate, and it probably is, until someone reminds us that we got it wrong, or says, "Oh no, I was there with you at dinner, and no, you didn't eat that. You ate this." I'm like, "Oh yeah, I forgot. That was the day before. I ate that. Okay, last night I ate such and such." It's only then that we realize, oh, something happened with our belief-forming cognitive faculties that led us astray for a moment, and then it's corrected. And so that's life. That's just how we do life, and it's unreasonable, including the life of the scientist or the life of the philosopher. And so it's unreasonable to sort of raise the evidential bar on us beyond what we actually do day in and day out. It would completely undercut even the doing of the sciences. So
Right.
yeah, so it's for these kinds of reasons that I think it's just absurd to think the sciences are the only way we know things. That's surely not the case. And it's way too high a standard. If we held that up as the standard, we really wouldn't know very much. And
Right.
it would lead us to these other kinds of weird questions about, well, what do you mean by the sciences? And as philosopher of the sciences will remind us, is there are no hard boundaries on what constitutes a science versus not. That's a surprising thing for a lot of us who are, I don't know about your schooling background, my schooling background. Oh, there's the scientific method. And once you learn the science, well, now you're doing science. Like, theoretical physics doesn't use the scientific method. And what is the scientific method? There are actually dozens of scientific methods and so forth and so on. But I digress. But
Yeah.
good question, because it does get at this intuition that to form good beliefs, no, we don't need lots of empirical evidence that other people can see. Not always. Sometimes that's the
Yeah.
right kind of evidence. But maybe what we really need is for our belief-forming faculties, what's going on in our heads, to be functioning the proper way in the proper environments. And that's what leads us to beliefs that have this positive epistemic status.
Okay. So one question I have is, so what you are implying is that we are very much rational to accept them unless we find a reason that there's some issue there. Like with the example, like yesterday I had this and this so and so thing, but then now someone reminded me that no, that was day before yesterday. So I'm like, okay, now because I have this reason, now I'm very much justified to reject that thing at face value. But unless I don't have that, I like, it should be the default. Like I know you say something which I really like, which is like they are innocent until proven guilty and not guilty until proven innocent. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's correct. It's a line that I've taken from philosopher Nicholas Wolterstorff. He likes to use that, and I think that's right. We go through life forming beliefs that we quite reasonably treat as innocent until proven guilty. And that's just to say, we need evidence that something has gone wrong. Now, that's not any and all beliefs, but it is the preponderance of our day-to-day things. Like when we look outside, and like today, I look outside, I can see it's a sunny day, and I see birds of various sorts. Well, I'm justified in believing that those are real birds. Because non-inferentially, they immediately sort of hit my cognitive faculties. I have no reason to think my cognitive faculties are misleading me. I'm using them under the proper conditions. Birds is a perfectly reasonable thing to be outside my window at this time of day. Maybe not where you are, but where I am at this time of day, perfectly reasonable for there to be birds. It may turn out to be the fact that those are not birds, but they're little machines that some, mad scientist has put in my yard to deceive me. It's possible, but it's not
Right.
reasonable. But I don't need to go and inspect them all and try to catch them and make sure that they're birds before believing they're birds. I don't need to do that kind of extra investigation on my beliefs about what my name is, who my wife is, who my children are, what I ate for breakfast. No, these are beliefs that are innocent until proven guilty. Uh,
Right.
there,
So
so
when we
yeah,
come to the next question, which is when it comes to God, so then we have to investigate under normal conditions. Is it like, is it the default for under normal conditions for people to believe in something like a God, or like
yeah,
an agent, to see agency in nature and
that's
teleology?
that's right. That's good. So clearly, you've done your homework. Well done. Uh, yes, I'm one of a number of scholars. Some of us believe in God and some don't. I want to be clear about that. Not everybody
Hmm.
is sort of religious in any kind of traditional sense here, and some are definitely not. But those of us working in cognitive science of religion, at least a lot of us, think that one of the reasons why belief in God is so widespread across cultures and throughout history, at least one kind of God, um, and often gods who are involved in bringing about the natural order around us that account for why there are birds outside my window, why the sun does shine, why there's a world at all. Um, that belief in these kinds of gods arise in part because we have a natural readiness, we have natural predispositions to form those beliefs. We're ready to believe those. And why are we ready to believe those? Because of these different belief forming faculties that we have in our heads that do lots of just ordinary work. They're not special religion faculties or something like that. It's not that there's a little neural cluster that's all right, that's the God thing. It's like, no, it's the whole thing is the God thing, it turns out.
Hmm.
That, for instance, the work by developmental psychologist Deborah Kellerman over the last 25 years or so has shown in a really nice incremental way that from early childhood, we have a strong tendency to see design and purpose in the natural world. When we look out and we see mountains or rivers or trees or birds, we think they have a purpose, they have a function, and a little bit like Plantinga's argument, that function is best accounted for by someone gave them that purpose. Maybe that's why they were created, or at least arranged in such a way that they have that kind of a purpose. She's developed very clever experiments to investigate this. Many of them are giving children examples, 3-4-year-old children, examples of pictures of animals like a tiger and having them, generate explanations of the tiger. Why do we have tigers? And then taking those explanations and then having children choose between different kinds of explanations, purely mechanical explanations or purposeful, what are called teleological explanations, that it has purpose or design. And children tend to prefer, oh no, tigers are here for a reason. They're here to, and they may come up with bad reasons for why a tiger is here. Oh, tigers are supposed to be in the zoo. I'm like, well, that's a silly reason. But it also could be, no, tigers are here to, I don't know, eat goats. That's what tigers are for, is to eat goats and terrorize villagers. That's kind of the purpose of the tiger. Like, oh. And
But the
then you can
interesting
add,
part, so the
Sarah,
interesting part is that still they have some teleological inclinations, that there is some purpose there, whatever that might be right or
that's
wrong.
right.
That's a different thing.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right. They've got this sense that they've got a purpose, and asked the right way, young children will also show that, and they think that's why tigers are here. It's not just that they have a purpose; that's why they came
Hmm.
about. So rivers are here so that people have a place to go fishing, or tigers are here so that there's something to see in the zoo. Like, well, that's doesn't. I mean, we would say as adults those are crazy ideas, but the point she makes, and she's done these with adults too, in some really clever experiments, where you have to get adults to answer very quickly, and sort of unfiltered under what we call cognitive load conditions. You get science-educated adults making similar kinds of errors, if you want to call them that, but to suddenly revert to very teleological or purpose and function based kinds of explanations, or even intentional explanations. Someone made the tiger like this, someone made the mountains like this. And from a very young age, children are perfectly clear that humans can't do this. 3, 4-year-olds. And it's been done in many different countries. No, they know humans can't do this stuff. So it requires a special kind of someone who intended the purpose, the design of things in the natural world. That's so it seems that Kellerman has argued, and I've examining her evidence, I agree. The evidence seems to suggest that children have a natural propensity. We all, I should put it that way, we all, but from childhood, have a natural propensity to see design and purpose in the world around us and understand that not all of that is coming from human beings. But we think it comes from someone or someones. It could be multiple someones, I guess, in principle. So, and that's just one of the factors that would then make us receptive to the idea of God. There are others.
Yeah. So there was one more study, like, I think which you reference sometimes, which is that they did some experiment with children where they were showing how, I think it was a game or something where they created an agent like a smiley or something. And, when that goes into the box and, when order is there, it's very natural for them to understand that agents create order, and it's very surprising for them that, chaos can create order, something like that, right? Am I correct?
You are correct. Now I'm going to have to remember now whose work is this? George. I'm forgetting his last name. Sorry, it was a Yale University study. It was conducted at Yale University, and you're right. What they showed is that even in infants, so babies who aren't even really talking and much yet, already have the expectation that if something is an agent, and all you have to do in these infant studies is put a smiley face on a ball and make it sort of move on a computer screen in a weird kind of way. And then it activates the circuitry in our brains that says, that's not just an ordinary object. That is an agent. That is a minded thing doing stuff. Well, if it's a minded thing doing stuff, they understand that it can create order or disorder, right? Big sister can walk into the room and destroy things, but big sister can also walk into the room and tidy things up and put them in order. And the way we do these studies with really little kids is different kinds of looking designs where you put a kid in front of a screen and have them look at something until, and build up an expectation. And then you show them something else and see if it recovers their attention. And if it does, they're seeing something surprising. Or you can put things side by side and look at which one do they pay attention to. There are lots of different modifications that you can do on this. But in their study, what they found was when there was what's called an occluder, a barrier in the way of whatever the stuff is that's going to be ordered or disordered, if an agent goes behind there and then the screen drops and suddenly there's order out of chaos, they kind of go, yeah, saw that coming, but in the infant sort of way. It doesn't recover their attention. They're not terribly interested or surprised. But if it wasn't an agent that went behind there, if it was a ball or something like that, just a regular round object, and suddenly there's order, they're like, whoa, wait a minute, show me that again. I did not see that coming, right? It recovers their attention. And so that difference in response then led the Yale researchers to infer. George Newman, that's it. George Newman, Frank Kyle, and others. It led them to the inference of, even very early in life, preschoolers, infants, have the expectation that agents bring about order or disorder. But you got to have an agent. Non-agents can't order things. Right. So I'm glad you bring that up, because it's yet more evidence that we have this expectation that when we see design and order in the natural world, which we seem to do, we have this expectation that, and someone, an intentional being, brought that about. We don't just think, dumb luck. Go ahead.
So if I'm not wrong, there's one of the biggest studies that has ever been conducted, and you were a part of that study also, which was across many countries, and that also came to the same conclusion in 2011 or 12, if I'm not wrong.
Oh, I'm not sure which one you're referencing, but there have been a number of these studies. I don't think I was an author on a really big multinational of this type, but some of my students have been involved with these. Um,
Okay.
um,
And there's one more by Olivera Petra. It's not so big, but there is one more, right? By
yeah, Olivera Petrovich at Oxford, she replicated a number of studies that Jean Piaget did way back when.
yeah.
Looking at how children understand the creation of things like the moon and mountains and animals and things. And she's the one who has, among others, but she uncovered pretty convincing evidence that even preschool children are fully aware that humans do not make mountains or lakes. 3-year-olds understand this, that it requires gods to do this sort of thing. And they expect that, even in a relatively secular kind of place like Oxford, England, where there are plenty of atheists around, maybe even majority atheists, and yet their children seem to expect that no, it takes God to make things like mountains and moons, but
Wow.
people make buildings and clothing and things like that. So all of this research points in this direction that we've got this natural, Kellerman calls it teleofunctional reasoning, which is a mouthful, but basically the point is that we naturally see design and purpose in the world around us. Some of it is made by humans, and those are the artifacts, those are books, clothes, houses, but we also tend to think that plants and animals have purpose, function, and that someone intended that purpose and function, unless we were taught otherwise. So that's the interesting thing about some of Kellerman's later work, is suggesting that the default position is seeing design and purpose, but different educational programs, like for instance in atheistic China, mainland China, they're pretty good at training kids out of those intuitions and say, no, your intuitions about this are wrong. There isn't any design and purpose. Okay, so we tend to believe it unless we were taught otherwise. Now, what to make of that philosophically is another issue.
So you've said,
Yeah.
so one quote that I have, from you say the playing field is tilted towards religious beliefs and practices, and you need cultural correlates to inhibit, not to teach, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would want to nuance that, but that's a really good summary of the idea. And I'm pushing it back against this idea that some thinkers have tried to popularize over the last 20 years that, the reason that people are religious is because of this routinized, heavy indoctrination, right? That it's because their parents sort of force them to believe and even threaten them with, punishment if they don't believe in all of this. And those of us working in cognitive science of religion, I think most of us at this point say, well, that's not what the evidence suggests. The evidence suggests that it's really easy for kids to adopt at least many religious beliefs. Not all. They're fancy theological beliefs that are kind of hard for all of us. But the basic idea that there is at least one God and maybe there are spirits of various sorts, and that there's something that about us that might exist beyond death, that's separable from our physical bodies. That seems to be a very natural and intuitive thing for children. Those kinds of beliefs are the conceptual path of least resistance. So the playing field is tilted in their direction, and what it requires is special cultural conditions, education, indoctrination, if you will, to discourage that kind of thinking. So it really requires some kind of totalitarian state like the Chinese government, who is invested in people not believing in God, to really work hard to persuade people not to believe in God. And then they pull it off. Just a fun little footnote on this. One of the most atheistic countries in the world by number of people believing in God, proportion of is Iceland. drifting up there in the North Atlantic. But they have at least last I checked, it may be changing, but a very high rate of belief in these sort of nature spirit kind of beings they call the hidden people.
Wow.
Like at least 10 years ago, it was a majority of their population. So it's not the case that just because
Wow.
you don't believe in God, you believe in nothing's what you might call supernatural. Now, they wouldn't necessarily regard them as supernatural because they're part of nature, but they are still these intentional agents with superhuman abilities that account for things we see in the natural world around us. So I like to think of it this way: is we've got a conceptual space for those kinds of beliefs, and then the culture
Just
helps give us the
yeah.
particulars. Sorry, go ahead.
So just one thing which reminds me, which you had mentioned about these people who believe in these elves in Iceland, is that they also have some law where they have to take permission to build a road. They have to take permission from those elves, only then they can build a road or like a pathway, or they can't. Something like that, right?
That's right. So the belief was so deep culturally that it was even codified into law. If you want to build a road here or put up a new building, you have to consult with the hidden people who are
Right.
somewhere between an elf and a fairy. Now, maybe they've changed that in the last 10 years, but until strikingly recently, these were common beliefs. And
Right.
even in China, even in a place that has a government that is very much invested in people not believing in God and not being religious, all kinds of ancestor worship practices and other kinds of what you might think of as folk religious practices are extremely common. So it seems to suggest, again, between the psychological evidence, the cross-cultural anthropological evidence, the historical evidence, that actually believing in some kind of gods, spirits, and so forth, that's actually the natural starting point for us as human beings, at least
Right.
natural as social beings. And it takes effort to sort of undo that work. That's my
Right.
story for now. That's what I think the evidence is pointing toward.
Right. So back to the argument. So if that is the default, as like, to reiterate what you were speaking, so we have plenty of evidence, like you reference so many different cognitive scientists, and so there'll be like anthropological literature that would again point to the same thing, where every culture in the past, like, reference to believing in God or spirit, something like that. And there are so many studies, all of that corroborate and collaborate to the same, like, conclusion, which is that belief in God is natural. And then how does this actually strengthen the case for the argument that we are presenting?
Well, what it does is it bypasses an easy objection. Okay, so as Plantinga himself noted he even offered the objection. Here's an objection to my argument. So quick reminder, right? We have beliefs we think are true and warranted or have positive epistemic status. We think they're good beliefs to hold, is another way to put it. Perhaps the best way to make sense of having beliefs that are good ones to hold on to, positive epistemic status, is that the machinery that made the beliefs was working right in the right kinds of environments. But working right or working correctly implies that there's a purpose or function for those beliefs, that they're aimed at something. Well, where did they get that from? Someone. An easy sort of rebuttal to that or objection is, whoa. We've been down this road before. This is an argument from design. And it is. Plantinga acknowledges that. And like other arguments from design for God, well, what about evolution? Right? Evolution is a case that looks like design, but isn't. So it does the kinds of stuff that look like design, but you don't really need a designer after all. So maybe it's the case, the objector might say, that our cognitive faculties are doing the right work because they were designed by natural selection. They were designed in an evolutionary process to bring about these true beliefs, or, beliefs with positive epistemic status. So you don't need God. Evolution will do the job here. So that's one big objection that Plantinga himself anticipates. And
Wouldn't this be wouldn't this be a conflation between mechanism and agency, where the evolution is just a mechanism? Now, if someone is saying that evolution, for example, natural selection is responsible for all this, they cannot account for that, because we need to have this kind of teleological understanding embedded in the explanation. And if you just believe in naturalism, you cannot ascribe any kind of teleology to these mechanisms. Am I correct?
yeah, I think that's right. It sure looks that way. In fact, that's the whole point, right? The whole point of evolutionary theory is there is no teleology. And so it's entirely unclear whether it's the case that evolution is a good substitute for God in this kind of in this kind of an argument. You're like, so no, I need someone to bring about this design. Oh, well, evolution can be your someone. It's like, well, no, the whole point of evolution is it doesn't design, right? That it can't sort of be the guarantor of your faculties being truth aimed.
Right.
Now, some people will argue, but it can, because we couldn't have survived, right, if our cognitive faculties weren't truth aimed. That would work against natural selection. So it's pretty obvious, isn't it, that we have to have trustworthy belief forming faculties. They have to be reliable. Now, Plantinga and I have, in the essay, offer some objections to that. Some of them get a little bit technical, but I think some are straightforward. They are things like, well, wait a minute. If accepting the evolutionary story of animals and living things, there are living things that have been with us much longer than humans have. It's often pointed out that if the evolutionary story is correct, humans are, and you think of sort of the history of the world as a year, humans are showing up like 5 minutes before midnight on, New Year's Eve. We've almost not existed. We're just an afterthought. We haven't been here long enough to even sort of deserve the title of being adaptive. So at this point, we might just be some weird genetic drift. I'm slightly overstating it, but that's kind of, we often hear this story. But the point is, compared to, say, sharks, I don't know, cockroaches, a wonderful example. Alligators, many kinds of birds. We have barely been here. And yet, for all of those different kinds of animals, we would never say that they have truth-aimed belief-forming faculties, right? That they have cognitive contents. They have representations of propositions that constitute well-formed beliefs. I have chickens in my backyard. I raise chickens for eggs. I have my chickens back there. I don't think they have true beliefs.
Is that true?
It is true. And it is true. I don't think they have true beliefs, but they survive really well. They're tough.
Right.
They take care of business. And at least their ancestors, the Southeast Asian jungle fowl, has been here a lot longer than humans have. Without true beliefs, without positive epistemic status. So it's not obvious that we need things like beliefs to survive. Now, at this point, my objector says, yes, but once you have an animal with beliefs, surely those beliefs need to be true. And we can get technical here again and say, well, are beliefs even causally potent is one way to talk about it. Do they do any real work, or is it just our neurophysical kinds of states? Because some scientists really think that our consciousness, our awareness, our thoughts, and therefore our beliefs are epiphenomenal. They lay on top of our neural circuits just firing. And the neural circuits firing is what does the real work that makes us decide, ooh, I'm going to eat that. or, oh, I'm
Yeah.
going to run away from that. Those sort
Hmm.
of core survival instincts, that the beliefs just sort of float on top of them. Well, if they float on top of them, then they were not selected for by natural selection.
Hmm.
So they're not part of the story. So why should we trust them? Now, supposing for some reason that no one has yet been able to sufficiently explain, they are causally potent. That is, they really did do work and they really were selected for. Well, then we need to establish that they were actually selected for fitness reasons that are truth tracking. And it's pretty easy, at least I think, to see that because of other animals, they can go through life doing most of the basic fitness stuff without actually forming accurate beliefs or true beliefs in even humans. So if I'm wandering through the woods and I'm trying to figure out what's good to eat and what isn't, important stuff, what should I be eating? I don't really form conscious beliefs about eat that, don't eat that, eat that, don't eat that. I just have, it seems to me, behavioral impulses in that direction, but I don't form a proposition. This variety of mushroom is very good to eat. This variety of mushroom will poison me, so I will not eat that kind of mushroom. If that's right, if we aren't constantly forming those kinds of explicit beliefs, but most of the time just doing what we do, largely unconsciously, well, then again, it's an example of where we don't really need beliefs to do most of the basic survival. Where these beliefs come into place that philosophers are so fond of talking about is actually in this reasoning system, thought to be largely subserved by the prefrontal cortex right behind our eyes, which is evolutionarily very recent, very, very recent in animal history. And even if you look at sort of ancient skulls of pre-humans, they're lacking most of this that we have. It's possible they had very thin sort of thought lives, that until you get to at least Homo erectus or something like that, that's when you start getting real robust thinking and experiencing and things that you might call beliefs. Well, those have barely been with us. And maybe they're actually mostly doing different kind of work, the reasoning faculty. What kind of work? Ugo Mercier and Dan Sperber have suggested, for instance, that they largely do the work of trying to persuade other people to agree with us, that they do social work. Robin Dunbar has shown sympathy for this idea that a lot of our big brain, this prefrontal cortex, and our reasoning is actually to negotiate social relationships and to coordinate social action. So it's not that I need to have a true belief for me all by myself. I need to persuade you to work with me to solve some kind of problem. And if I can give you some kind of a belief that will make you do that, great, that solves the social problem. But I don't need the belief to be true. I just need it to be motivating. Right?
Wow.
I need the belief to motivate. Now, Mercier and Sperber might be wrong about this. I don't know if they're right about this. That's not the point. The point is, it is plausible that our reasoning has arisen for non-truth-seeking reasons. Because after all, natural selection really ultimately isn't interested in truth. It's interested in you getting your body in the right place to do the things to keep it alive and to help it reproduce, just like any other animal, according to evolutionary theory, if that makes sense. So it's not really about true beliefs. So actually, naturalistic evolution, that is, evolution that presumes there is no God involved in the process at all, actually is a pretty poor substitute for guaranteeing that the factory that's producing ideas was aimed at producing good, true, reliable, warranted ideas. Because it wasn't. It was aimed at making sure that our genes get replicated.
Right.
That's the claim of evolutionary theory, after all. So it's not obvious at all that evolution by natural selection actually serves as a good designer in this kind of design argument, at least for our minds. But you would ask,
example.
Yeah, go ahead, please, and then I'll come back to how does the Deb Kellerman and all of that cognitive science and religion work tie in. I'll get there. But Go
So
ahead.
there was one example, I think one YouTuber was using regarding this. He was saying that, a human being can believe either tigers are dangerous and they can kill him, and that is why he runs away from a tiger, or a human being can believe that tigers do black magic, and that is why he can run away from the tiger. Both of them would ensure very well that the human being survives in the end. So why choose this belief over that belief? Like, you cannot use natural selection to make a case for choosing the right belief over the wrong belief. Am I correct?
That is one of Plantinga's examples. Yeah, that's right. He uses the
Okay.
tiger in that way.
Okay.
Or even taking something less dramatic, you might think, when I walk around a path through the woods, I have to be careful about where I step so I don't fall down and get hurt. It's not the case. We might think, oh, well, so you have to have true beliefs from your perceptual system about where to put your next step so that you don't fall down. And I would insist, no, we don't form beliefs. We form action routines. And if you doubt it, just walk through the woods having a conversation with someone. Do you ever form
Right.
a belief about where you should put your next step? No, you're not even thinking about it, but you can do it seamlessly. Because
Right.
as many psychologists, especially in recent decades, have been emphasizing, Jonathan Haidt is probably most famous for this, that probably most of the day-to-day life work that we do is happening below conscious level. So it is not in the belief realm. The philosophers might say it's non-doxastic is the fancy term to talk about it. Haidt uses the metaphor of the rider and the elephant. So your consciousness is sort of a rider on top of an elephant. Ultimately, the elephant goes where it wants to. You might be able to persuade the elephant to do certain things at certain times, but an elephant can easily overpower you, right? And just do what it wants to do. Likewise,
Right.
most of our cognition, it just does what it needs to do, which is it's good for us. It would be exhausting if we had to pay attention to, if we had to form beliefs, let alone make sure
Right.
the beliefs are really good ones about where to put our next step, what to
Right.
put in our mouth now. I mean, it would just be exhausting. So no, that's not how psychology works.
Okay.
So
Coming
yes.
back to
No, I'm glad you brought up
how. Yeah.
since we're talking a lot about tigers, I'm glad you brought that one back up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
How do we tie this up with the studies of Deborah Kellyman and others?
yeah, how do we tie this up? Well, somebody might say, okay, that's all fine and dandy. But the reason why you think that this system looks like it needs a designer behind the design is because we have this natural propensity towards seeing design, as Deb Kellerman has demonstrated. So doesn't that call into question whether there really is design here and that's really required? Or is that kind of an illusion because that's just what humans do, is we find design everywhere? So that's one kind of objection that you might hear, and I have heard those kinds of objections. Does that kind of make sense?
Right. Yeah.
Now, I think there's actually a pretty straightforward response to that, and that's simply that, well, there's a straightforward kind of dismissive one, and there's a more interesting one. The dismissive one is usually when we're thinking philosophically, usually when we're reasoning, if people have very strong intuitions that are shared across cultures, that lots of people have, we actually take that as evidence for something, not against it. Right? So if you read most philosophical treatises, there's all kinds of thought problems like we've been discussing and other things where it says, it seems like, it seems like it's bad to murder your mother in her sleep. Let's just assume that that's true. And we go on with it because we all agree that we have this intuition that it's bad to murder your mother in her sleep. If I can come up with an evolutionary explanation for why you think it's bad to murder your mother in her sleep, like maybe it's good to have moms around because they support you as you develop and grow. They might invest in your children, and that makes you more fit from an evolutionary perspective. There's an evolutionary reason why you think it's bad to murder your mother in your sleep. Therefore, it's not bad to murder your mother in your sleep. What? That's crazy talk.
Right.
Okay, that is just doesn't even that's turning philosophy on its head. Usually we'd say, "Whoa, wow, I have really good reasons for that intuition
Right.
that it's bad to murder my mother. I now understand better why it is that this is widely shared." And so if I find somebody who doesn't think this, I think something's wrong with them. They've been hit in the head too hard. They were dropped on their head as a child. I don't know what. Something bad happened to them if they don't think it's wrong to murder their mother in her sleep. Okay? Because I have not just sort of the widespread evidence that everybody shares this intuition, but I have even a backing up reason of why we have it. That makes it more compelling for most of us, not less compelling. A different variation on this sort of thing is, well, that's a childish way of thinking. That sort of Kellerman shows that from early childhood, we have this tendency to see design and purpose in the world around us. So that's childish thinking. Like, okay, that's just a label that you put on it to make it sound bad. Like somehow we're supposed to outgrow it. But again, that turns at least our usual kind of even evolutionary and developmental thinking on its head. Most of the time, the stuff that we learn really early in life, those default assumptions are there because they're very good for us. They're there for really good reason, right? One of the other early developing things that we do in life is selectively pay attention to human faces. Oh, well, that's childish. Why are you paying attention to human faces? What? I mean, it just doesn't even make sense. Somewhere probably within the first 2 years of life, we form this idea that other people have beliefs and perception. And within a year or two beyond that, we figure out that it's not the same as ours. So we call this theory of mind. We think other people have minds. Well, that's childish. Give that up. I mean, it's just a crazy way to argue. Now, of course, there are some philosophers who have given that up. They really have. They don't think that we actually, but they are very few and far between, and they don't expect most of us to believe them, I think. But it's just a crazy way of arguing.
Right.
Now, there is a slightly more interesting way to argue from these evolutionary accounts, I guess, that would go somewhere along the lines of, well, maybe it's the case that this teleofunctional reasoning or this thinking about design and purpose in the natural world is an example of one of these belief-forming faculties that is misfiring, that is being used in the wrong context. Okay? And so by Plantinga's own argument, it's leading to beliefs that do not have high positive epistemic status. Because what's the mechanism for? What did it evolve to solve? Maybe you're using it out of that context when you're thinking you see design behind human minds, for instance, and behind our beliefs. Okay, so that's a more interesting argument. I think that's a more interesting kind of counter argument. Does that one make sense?
Yeah.
You see what I'm getting at there? Now, I do have kind of a response to that, but I want to make sure that we've got that one. So the idea is, right, back to Plantinga's original assertion, which is that, go ahead.
Yes. So now the objection is maybe this is a misfiring of our cognitive system.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
So,
or it's working in the wrong context. It's
right.
solving the wrong problem.
Right.
It would be a little bit like saying, okay, there's a button factory that makes buttons, but you've used it to make, I don't know, pencils. Well, you can't expect that it's going to make good pencils. It's a button factory after all.
Right.
Or the button factory works perfectly fine when you when you use plastics, but not if you use wood to, as your materials.
Right.
Then it doesn't work so well. And you're using it you're putting wood into it and trying to make buttons. It might be analogous to that. Does that make sense?
So a very simple response, what comes to my head would be, we haven't demonstrated that is that is a misfiring. We're just assuming that it is a misfiring. Am I correct?
Right. That's correct. And We'll come back to that one, but you're absolutely right. That's an assumption that's sort of built in. And partly it's because, frankly, we don't know, with assuming that this is an evolved belief-forming faculty, if you want to call it that. Okay, let's grant that, and let's assume that that it evolved for particular purposes. We don't know what those purposes are. And there are a couple of really reasonable candidates out there. One of those is that it evolved in the context of tool making, right? Because humans make things, and it's to be a good tool user or to modify tools, it's important to be able to very quickly pick up on what's it for. That might have been really handy. And so maybe it's a late evolving kind of thing, late meaning after tools start becoming important to us as a species. Okay, maybe that's right. But it could be the case that it evolved just before that and actually helped us start making tools. So we looked around the natural world and we saw things like, tiger's claws, since we've been talking a lot about tigers, we'll keep going. Tiger's claws are really good at scratching things and tearing and ripping because of the particular shape. So if I find a stone that has that shape, maybe I can use that to tear, and because it has similar structure, it must have similar function or purpose. So now my teleofunctional reasoning actually helps me invent tools, but its proper domain of application is actually in the natural world. So maybe actually the mechanism evolved precisely to reason about things in the natural world. And so these aren't misfires at all. Now, we just don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. We don't know. It's a not very strong objection if you don't know. You're just making it up, right? You don't have evidence one way or the other. And to make things even more complicated, when it comes to evolved faculties, we know that many of our faculties evolve for one thing and then they get used for something else later. It's in the jargon of evolution, it's called exaptation. So it evolves for one thing and suddenly it's being used for something else. But if it's get used for that other thing long enough, then the winnowing effect of natural selection, well, it's had time to operate. So why wouldn't we trust the deliverances of that too? So maybe the back to our button factory. If the button factory keeps making buttons out of plastic or wood sufficiently over time, even though it was only designed to use plastic and now it's using wood, but it does a pretty good job with it, then we trust it to make wooden buttons too. There's nothing wrong with that. And that seems to actually be how evolution, at least by theory, commonly works. So it's a not terribly strong objection in that respect, just because we can't pin it down. We don't know. But I love the point that you raised right off the bat, which is we don't know if it's operating in error. So I was emphasizing that is this system operating in the context it's supposed to? You emphasized, is it making mistakes? And the two are closely related, but they're good to tease apart, because here's where things get interesting. If I'm an atheist objector, I think, well, surely this thing is operating in error, right? It's telling people essentially someone designed tigers. And that's not right. Well, how do I know that's not right? Well, because I've already rejected the possibility that there's a God who designed tigers, or forest spirits, or whatever you like that designed the tigers. I've already rejected that. Well, that's called question begging in philosophy, and it's cheating. But it does show that when you are the naturalist or the atheist in this space, you automatically think that that faculty is more error prone, right? Because if it leads to religious beliefs that you've rejected, then yeah, it's making errors. But the person who believes in God and that God designed tigers, or God used evolution to design tigers, it doesn't matter, that there's God in the system somewhere. Well, that person doesn't think that it's making errors. That God could have given us this faculty that detects design and purpose accurately. And so it's not as error prone. So it's a more trustworthy faculty if you're a theist than if you're a non-theist, which is kind of interesting,
Right.
because now you've got
Yeah.
additional reasons for trusting it.
Yeah. So I have one point there, which is like some atheists would use something that we have, like, hyperactive agency detection device or theory of mind, and they might say that this is because we have this thing, and this is the reason we believe in God or anything. But this is problematic, like, this is wrong, this is like misfiring, or this is flawed. If that is the case, we would of course ask for the criteria, like, what is the criteria for us to judge if this is a mistake? Because in the end, for example, you have used this example, and I really like this example, that if I'm talking to you right now, you seem to be a minded being because of, like, my theory of mind and hyperactive agency device. So if that is, like, if I don't have a criteria, I might just have to reject all agency that I see. But I, at least with you or with some other human beings, I find it to be very much reliable. So without, like, some people are like, no, but you are okay with believing in these people, but not your agency going beyond physical things, and that is where they're presupposing materialism in the mix.
Yeah,
Right.
good. Well said. That's right. That's right. And it's I think one of the important bits that cognitive science of religion, at least most of us who work in this space, emphasize is that the belief forming faculties that we're talking about are widespread, right? Like we said at the very beginning, there's no God spot. There's no special circuitry just for God. There's teleological reasoning. There is theory of mind. There is, and you can keep adding. There are all of these more general, they're not super general, but they're a little more general kinds of mechanisms for forming beliefs that we use in what you might call religious contexts, but also outside of those in sort of more ordinary contexts. So theory of mind, yeah, I might use that for thinking about, well, what does God want from me? But I might use it for thinking about what you're thinking right now and whether we're understanding each other. So I'm using that theory of mind. And if you want to say that my theory of mind is somehow broken or misfiring because I use it to think about God, well, then I've got a faulty theory of mind system. More importantly, billions of people around the world have faulty theory of mind systems. And suddenly, actually, that's the normal thing, is to have a faulty theory of mind system. Well, if that's right, and from a naturalist perspective, the perspective that there are no supernatural beings at all of any sort, God or anything else, from that perspective, if that's right, then we've got widespread evidence for bad cognitive faculties that are misfiring all the time. And not just misfiring, well, if they're misfiring all the time, why do we trust them in regular interpersonal interactions with each other? And so maybe we shouldn't. And so it should maybe lead us to be very skeptical about other people's minds and thoughts. Okay, are you willing to so-called bite the bullet or swallow that pill?
Right.
And then on top of that, it adds another interesting issue, which is if you believe that's true, then here, once again, we have evidence of a common belief-forming faculty that has been widespread, that is very widespread. You say, naturalist, that doesn't work right. And evolution made it. So it undercuts confidence in thinking that evolution by natural selection leads to truth-aimed, reliable belief-forming faculties.
Right.
But somebody who believes in God doesn't have that problem. They go, yeah, God did it.
Yeah.
So I don't have to be completely skeptical about this. I can go about my daily life. Thank you very much.
Right. So in the end, this actually makes the argument from the evolutionary argument against naturalism even stronger. Like it adds on to it.
I think it does. I think that's right.
Yeah.
Do your
Yeah.
listeners know what the evolution, this
Yeah,
argument
we
is?
had Professor James Kelly Clark, and he explained in the
Ah,
last discussion, so they might be aware of
wonderful.
this.
Excellent. Yeah, that's right. I do think that Plantinga's argument is even stronger once we start looking more carefully at how cognitive systems work and what we've been finding in the cognitive science of religion.
Right. So this was pretty interesting. Do we have like a fourth? So did we cover all the objections? Is there any objection that you comes to your mind which we have to tackle? Supposedly.
I think we covered the interesting objections and then some. But are there some issues that you're thinking about that you'd like to talk about?
I have something that maybe we can like one question I have.
Sure.
Which is related to agnosticism. So generally there's a trend that people now moving away from atheism, and they think that agnosticism is more like a sane position, a more rational position, and that should be the default. But if we analyze this argument and your work and all of cognitive science of religion, we get to know that no, agnosticism itself is not the default. That like trying to be skeptical about God's existence, but generally people would not be skeptical of all the other natural dispositions that they have. That itself would be being selectively skeptical and is not justified. What do you have to say about that?
Oh, that's interesting. I hadn't heard that kind of argument before. Right. So if I'm understanding you correctly, it might go this way. That because I guess there are lots of possible reasons why we might want to be hesitant about committing to God's existence or not. And if one of the reasons why you're hesitant is because there are these natural propensities to believe in some kind of a God, that's not very good reason for being hesitant unless you're also prepared to be hesitant about the other, what we might call natural deliverances of our cognitive faculties. So what would those things be? That other people have minds, that
Free will,
they're free will. That's a good example.
causality,
Oh, yeah, good. Causality of various sorts, sure. Certainly
validity
lots
of
of
the past,
the
the
past.
valid, yeah,
Yeah, all kinds of moral claims. You know,
yeah.
like murdering your mother in her sleep. Yeah, I mean that would be
Right, right, right,
presumably one of those, or at least many of these so-called moral foundations that also seem to have similar kinds of maturational naturalness. So you wouldn't want to use that as criteria for being an agnostic. That would put you in, unless you're prepared to be just skeptical about pretty much everything.
right,
In which case, it's really hard to function.
right.
And I know that's not a super strong argument for some people. Well, so what? I can't function. Well, I don't know. Some thinkers have thought that if your reasoning leads you into serious trouble, maybe you took a wrong path somewhere.
Right.
And the best thing to do isn't keep going, but maybe turn around and go back.
Right.
Yeah. But I could, here's a stronger version though. What if it's the case that the reason I'm going to be agnostic is because, okay, sure, there are these natural propensities toward religious beliefs, but they tend to generate lots of different kinds of religious beliefs. Not all of them are the same. Some of them seem to conflict with each other. And so these natural, maturationally natural belief forming faculties, whatever you want to call them, maybe they're unreliable in that respect, at least with the deliverance of religious beliefs. And so that's why I'm going to be agnostic. I'm going to wait and see who wins, because I just don't know. There's too much conflict. But I suppose then the response would still be it's not clear, at least for moral beliefs and many other kinds of beliefs. Maybe even the nature of free will is becoming more debated. Some people think, there are lots of views on free will nowadays, views on the soul, whether we have one or not, whether it's separable from a body or not, those types of things. That's not the same as belief in God, right? Those are different kinds of things. Well, there's a lot of diversity on those too. And so you'd still then have at least two problems. One is you don't want to just selectively, in some prejudiced way, be agnostic about one set of beliefs as opposed to others. So you need to be agnostic about all of them. But I do worry that it still leads somebody who wants to embrace that kind of agnosticism to a position that it suggests that the deliverances of our minds then are, if you go this way, are just so conflicted for the wrong reasons that you can't trust them. Well, then it's hard for me to know why I want to be agnostic either, because that's a position I've arrived at through a reasoning mechanism that it can't be trusted.
Wow. Yeah.
So it still feels like it's a little bit self-defeating.
Right.
I said, but I put in a qualifier in there that some people are going to pick up on them for the right reasons, right? We can imagine a perfectly good belief forming mechanism that leads to a diversity of viewpoints. So early in our discussion, I referenced the birds outside my window. You and I if you were sitting here beside me and we were both looking out the window, we might both agree that there are birds outside my window. We might disagree what kind of birds they are.
Right.
Because they're moving too fast, they're too small. You and I have different experiences with birds. So, and I suspect that a lot of the religious beliefs, like exactly what is the character of the God who created the world? Well, that's more of a, which variety of bird are we talking about? We both agree there's a bird here. So maybe and with a lot of our moral divergences too, framed the right way, there tend to be actually a high degree of agreement over the basics, the basic moral principles.
It's more on the particular, not on the universals.
Yeah, maybe so.
When you use another example, I think in one of your lectures, which was a really nice example, that we if three people are walking by, they can see like claws on a tree. They can either infer, one can say that it was a lion, one can say it was a tiger, and one can say it was a bear. But in the end, the claws are there. So that is kind of universal, but similar between all of them.
Yeah, that's right.
And then there's one more
let me share that one though, because so that your listeners know the context of it. I have used this one in a number of lectures, and I say, look, my dear atheist friends, who I have a lot of atheist friends, but they often, I have had this kind of objection is, look, you religious people can't get your story straight. And that's why I'm not going to believe in God. And I say, well, isn't the situation a little bit like this, that you've got an Asian, a North American, and an African, and they're all hunters, and they go out into the forest, or they're naturalists, whatever you like. They know animals, and they know how to track, and they're out in the forest in South America, someplace maybe unfamiliar to them, or whatever. It doesn't matter. And they see these big claw marks on a tree, and the Asian says, there's a tiger here. We better get out of here. And the African says, no, it's not a tiger. It's a lion. We better get out of here. And the North American says, no, it's a bear. You're both wrong. It's a bear. We better get out of here. And their friend who is with them, I don't know, who doesn't know anything about these, says, look, you guys, you can't get your story straight. So I'm going to stay right here. If the disagreement is on the particulars, but not on the general category of the thing, then actually that's relevant convergence, I think. So likewise with at least some of our religious beliefs, we might get the particulars wrong about what the nature of this creator God is. And we may have real disagreements about that. It's not that those disagreements don't matter. But it would be a very strange response, I think, to then conclude, because you guys can't work out all of the particulars and agree who's right, then I can't trust any of you for being remotely close. I'm going to ignore all of the common ground and just walk away. Well, those are very poor grounds for being agnostic, it seems to me. But Sorry, you wanted to
Yeah,
go somewhere
thank you
else,
for
though.
no. Thank you for qualifying that. Yeah, that was good that we dwell into that. So you also use you quote Murray and you say that Murray grants Michael Murray
Mhm.
grants that religious beliefs across times and cultures are largely mutually inconsistent, but suggests that the incompatibilities arise from cultural sources and not basic natural functioning of human cognitive systems. Hence, plurality does not count against the belief forming mechanism's reliability. Is that correct?
That's correct. Good. Um, yeah, you
So,
anticipated the other thing I was thinking here. Yeah, as we were talking.
okay.
Wow, you really have done your homework. I'm impressed. Um,
So I had one question related to this, which is I was going through Robert McCauley's one video on YouTube, and he was discussing with another YouTuber. His name was Greg L. Bank, and he this YouTuber said, like was kind of asking or like insisting that he said that we don't actually like. So before I dwell into this one thing I want to clarify. So Robert McCauley for the audience. Uh, this makes a distinction between how we have like maturational naturalness and practice naturalness, and most religious beliefs like those universals are maturationally natural. They don't have to be practiced, they just naturally occur within us. uh, with that sense, the YouTuber was saying, we don't replace the intuition, like when it comes to the culture having an influence on us. He was saying we don't replace the intuition, we can kind of overlay something on top but never actually displace the intuition. So when a religious person familiarizes with a particular doctrine or particular theology, when it comes to religion, it doesn't replace kind of the full understanding of religion. It just sort of is a layer on top which can either intervene or not, depending on the level of reflection that someone is engaging in. To which Robert McCauley said, you have hit, like I think he said, yeah, you have hit the bullseye with your comment. Because of these maturationally natural systems, the theology is constructed very elaborate, but when folks are sort of on the ground doing straightforward inferences about the world in which they live in, which agents operate, that stuff kind of just drifts off, and all of these maturationally natural dispositions kick in. So people will draw in sort of unorthodox inferences. So what do I mean by that is, this is what Robert McCauley said. So people have natural dispositions. Let's say those are specific, uh, not very specific, but general understandings about God or other things, supernatural things. And culture can sort of be like or theology can lay on top of it, but it does not fully replace it, or it's not fully gone. Deeply it's still there. And that is why, for example, there are like atheistic cultures where people they learn from culture that they want to negate the idea of purpose or design, but still when they have probed a little, this comes out. Or for example, in emergency situation, people start seeing meaning, or start believing in God. For example, when a plane is crashing, this is something. So do you agree with something like this?
yeah, I think that's right. Another example of this is, well, beliefs about death. So Jesse Bering, who is a developmental and evolutionary psychologist, he's an atheist. He's very open about this. He's contributed to cognitive science of religion, but he's also studied atheists. And he has argued that atheists have trouble keeping their atheism straight because his interpretation, which I think is right, is that, like Macaulay said, we've got these intuitions that are very favorable toward finding meaning, purpose, seeing agents doing things in the world around us, and so forth. That if you're religious, you might call them, it's God's activity, or God's angels, or maybe it's evil forces are doing things. So Bering has these examples, like people who are atheists and claim that death is the end, there's nothing after it, being very concerned about what happens after their own death, right? They're being very particular about the wishes of what happens, that their wishes get carried out after their death. Why? You're not
Hmm.
there.
Hmm.
Or atheists reflecting on what their atheist friend at the funeral, when they're talking, oh, he would have really loved this. What does that even mean? Because you wouldn't love it if you were alive. You wouldn't love that they were having a funeral for you while you were alive. So what are you saying there? And Baring, at least through lots of interviews and sorts of atheists, right, at least, somewhat controversially, draws the inference that no, actually, it's just really hard. It's really hard to turn off, in this case, the idea that there's something about us that continues after death. He thinks that the idea of ourselves ending completely at death is actually really counterintuitive, that our intuition is that we just keep going. And so it's hard for people whose worldview, their metaphysics, their theology is that, no, this is the end, to turn that off. And now, to sort of apply this to religious folks, as a result, we even see this in religious traditions who don't think that death works that way. So even in religious traditions, like some branches of Christianity, when you die, you're dead. And at some future time, the dead will be resurrected. And then, if they had a proper relationship with Jesus or whatever it is, right? And they become resurrected. But right now, immediately after death, they're dead. And yet those same people who have that theology might think, well, my mom is watching me right now. Really? That's not in your theology at all.
Right.
But these Pascal Boyer, Harvey Whitehouse, and Claire White have a project right now called Wild Religions. And they're continuing in this with this idea that these intuitions that we have from our natural cognition actually lead to these really interesting combinations of the sort of theologically approved, what we say we believe, and these other kinds of activities, behaviors, and thoughts that we entertain very regularly.
Right.
They call sort of wild religions, or wild religious impulses and practices. So other examples are when we, for instance, try to get things from God by using weird little rituals and formulas that, strictly speaking, our theology would say, no, that's not the right way to do it, but we do it anyway, just in case. Apparently, lots of places in, say, Brazil, famous for these types of things. You go into the grocery store and you buy these little talismans and other kinds of stuff. Even the Christians will do it, even though it's not Christian, because it seems, well, you might as well. It's examples of wild religions. Or the Buddhist who thinks that that karma, this idea of karma, is non-personal, but then treats karma as an intentional being.
Yeah.
There are all these funny little things that happen. Or I guess Hindus might do that as well. Depending on their particular beliefs in karma.
So I think James Kelly Clark also mentions that in most Buddhist theologies, God is not like a person, or God does not exist altogether, but still, like, there are 40% or more Buddhists that still believe in a creator God. They don't have like this concept, but still they end up believing in something like that. Am I correct?
Depending on the branch of Buddhism, that's right. Yeah. So there are these interesting. This has sometimes also been called theological incorrectness.
Yeah.
D. Jason Sloan used that label. He uses some examples from Buddhism, but also from other traditions where it's somehow, because we've got these motivational and cognitive kind of engines that incline us towards certain kinds of religious beliefs in particular cultural settings or theological settings that kind of don't develop or affirm those, it doesn't matter. They still show up. Oh, here's a really good example. At least in Christian traditions, there is no theology of existing before you were born, right? Because reincarnation isn't a thing. I mean, maybe just barely before you were born, but most traditions, no, there's nothing said about it.
Right.
Well, a baby is born, and so there's this thought of maybe that's I don't know, if you believe in souls, that a soul is put into the baby inside its mother,
Right.
so it's born with, but the soul is created for that birth, or for that pregnancy. It's not hanging out doing stuff in a previous life, and then, okay, so it's not in Christian theology, at least not in a widespread sense, not in an orthodox sense. And yet, research suggests that in young children, in those same cultural contexts that are predominantly Christian, like in, say, Colombia, one of the studies was done. Natalie Ammons did this work. Belief in a pre-life is very high in children.
Wow.
Well, they
That's
weren't taught
fascinating.
that. They have to unlearn that. They weren't taught that by their parents because it's not part of the theology. And yet there it is. Somebody like Jesse Baring would say, yeah, and the reason it's there is because the idea of ourselves not existing is just too hard for us to conceptualize. And so you can play that forward after our death. It's hard for us to imagine not existing. What would it feel like when you die? Oh, well, let's see. No, it doesn't work that way. You can't run the simulation. Well, likewise. Okay, so before you were born, what were you like? Oh, well, wait a minute. Like it's hard to think those, and for reasons like that and others, conceptually, he says pre-life beliefs are almost expected. And sure enough, there's evidence that they don't increase with enculturation, they decrease with enculturation.
Right. So I have a
So
question.
there are these funny examples. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, something not very much related to the topic we're discussing, but something interesting comes to my mind. So just like we have natural dispositions of believing in God, we also have natural dispositions of believing in, for example, an afterlife, soul. Like Paul Bloom, Jesse Baring, Emma Cogan. I think they all argue for that thing. So wouldn't this can also be like an argument from positive epistemic status for afterlife?
Yes, that's right. Well spotted.
Yeah.
And so it's still the case that, well, it's at least the case that we give such beliefs the benefit of the doubt if they are widespread, if they seem to be the deliverances of our cognitive faculties in an automatic, non-inferential type of way. Okay, so we didn't reason to them. We didn't get them because of a mass media campaign. We still should give them the benefit of the doubt. And yes, it turns out that some of these natural kinds of beliefs, like maybe the belief in ghosts and ancestor spirits, actually very widespread. I don't happen to have a strong belief in that. I don't personally. That's not part of my theology. But I have to have good reasons not to believe that, as opposed to reasons, right? So I'm prepared to take my own medicine, as we say, and say, okay. Because it does seem to me that the reasonable reaction to the science is we've got sort of two choices. One is to start getting very skeptical about our belief-forming faculties, because the examples you gave, most of those really do have to do with this idea of this intuitive dualism, as Bloom called it, and Baring calls it, that some kind of separation between the true me and my body is possible, and that I am not equivalent to my body. It's true. The evidence seems to be, again, psychological evidence, cross-cultural evidence. It seems to be deep and wide in human existence. And it's only recently that people have really started to doubt that separation. Okay, well then, that kind of idea I should assume is sort of innocent until proven guilty.
Right.
Unless I'm prepared to say, whatever belief forming mechanism that is, I can't trust it. But if you referenced Paul Bloom, he wrote this book, as you know, Descartes' Baby. He
Right.
thinks that intuitive dualism underlies lots of different cultural kinds of expression, the arts, morality, all kinds of different areas. So if it's problematic for believing in ghosts, it's problematic for those other areas too.
Right. Right.
So either I need to be prepared to go, yeah, morality, I'm ready to give up on any other morality that's related to dualism, or I'm ready to give up on the beauty and the value of the arts that are related to dualism, if you agree with Bloom's argument.
Right. Right.
Or I go, I don't see that having this kind of a cognitive account actually undermines at all. It's descriptive, it's helpful for understanding the dynamics of it, and those beliefs perfectly good until I have a good reason to think otherwise. And maybe I do have good reasons to think otherwise. Maybe I've got good reasons to be what's called a monist when it comes to minds and bodies. Or maybe I have good reason to think that no, ghosts don't continue to, roam around the earth.
Right.
That's fine. But I need to have those reasons. And it's not fair of me to look down on or laugh at people who believe in ghosts just automatically, because no, there's really good reason that they believe in ghosts, and that's at least there are reasonable causes that lead one to be receptive to those ideas. So I shouldn't be all, oh, you believe in ghosts, how weird are you? It's like, no, that's normal. I'm the weird one, and I need to account for why I'm the weird one.
Right. In fact, there was one study that was done in America, which showed that I think more people believe in ghosts than they believe in God, something like that.
That's certain. I think that's true in the United Kingdom now. I'm not sure it's true in the
Okay.
United States, but it could be. It's possible.
Okay.
I would not be surprised.
Right.
That's the funny thing is those beliefs tend to, at least in many countries, they're actually they're negatively correlated, we would say, which is strange times we live in.
Also, you had mentioned. Okay, so I'll bring that question later. First, one thing I wanted to ask you. So you had a debate/discussion with Michael Shermer on the topic of afterlife, and I think you made an argument very similar to this, which argument for positive epistemic status for an afterlife, if I remember correctly. And Michael Shermer's only objection which he could come up with was diversity in this belief. And if we go through this conversation, I think we already dealt with that, right? In terms of the cultural diversity or particulars which can be different does not actually make a case for altogether you rejecting that belief altogether, like uprooting it altogether. Am I correct?
Yeah, that's right. It's a little bit like the lion, tiger, bear example.
Right.
It sure looks like all over the world people have this notion that something about us can persist after death, often can be active in the world around us, can be cited. Ancestor spirits, other kinds of ghosts or whatever they are, very common beliefs, seem to be largely non-inferential, as I've been describing it. And so they get the benefit of the doubt, because unless we're ready to swallow that bitter pill of skepticism, they're not irrationally formed. They're reasonably formed beliefs for the most part. That doesn't mean some people don't have some really kooky ones that were formed in bad ways. But as a general principle, we should give people the benefit of the doubt on those. And no, the diversity argument, I just don't find very compelling, because for just these reasons.
So just one question also I had, and then I'll move to the point that I had. You generally, I think on BBC Radio once you mentioned that, even, for example, if a child is raised on a desert island, like there's no human being there, still he would have susceptibility to believe in God. And people like Paul Bloom have also said the same thing, that even on a desert island or like an isolated place, people can still are likely to have to believe or have at least a concept of at least one God or many gods. Or for example, Bruce Hood has also said the same thing. Would you still accept that, even when children are, raised without human beings, they can still develop that idea?
Um, I'm going to do one of those obnoxious things that scholars do, which is to nuance a little bit. I
Right,
don't
right.
think you can raise children on an island without other humans around. And if you do, they're going to be weird. They're going to be really strange. But the basic point is,
Yeah.
and my friend and colleague Pascal Boyer, who works in this area, he was once asked this question, and I was there when he was asked it. The desert island. If you raised a child on a desert island, and he said, would they grow up religious? And he said, no, but if there were two of them, they would.
Oh, okay.
What he was trying to say in his very elegant way was, it does require some kind of social interaction to get a lot of what we call religion going. It's a social thing.
Okay.
It's not just an individual thing.
Okay.
And it is unlikely that a particular individual would form anything as developed as what we would call religions, even if they had sort of an inkling that there's more going on. Jesse Bering, actually, I believe, was the one who pointed to, apparently, Helen Keller, who was blind and deaf, right, famously, and so had very limited interaction with the world around her, claims to prior to learning how to communicate with the outside world, already was wondering about the design of the world around her and where it came
Wow.
from,
Yeah. That's a
allegedly.
good point.
So that's maybe a more interesting sort of test case, because, but yes, I still stand by it. I have been persuaded that at least early in my career, some of my bolder claims needed to be tempered a little bit. So I used to be enthusiastic about comparing the naturalness of religion to the naturalness of language, which I believe Paul Bloom has done as well. And while I still think there are some useful comparisons there, I find maybe even a slightly better comparison is with, this may sound surprising, but is with dance. with dancing,
Okay.
yes.
Okay.
So I don't know if you have kids. If you've ever been around little kids, if you turn on music, especially that has a good beat, they start moving. And humans are an unusual species in that we automatically will move in rhythm to each other. So even if people are working, like they're hammering, there's a tendency to slip into rhythm with each other. Or if you're walking with 3 or 4 other people, you tend to fall into rhythm with them. If you can, unless your legs are very different lengths, right? There's a tendency to fall into rhythm. And there are very few species that do things rhythmically like this with each other. You can count them on about one hand, I think. They're just it's very rare. It's thought to be maybe actually one of the conditions that gave rise to language, strangely. But in humans, nonetheless, we have this tendency to move in synchrony with each other. And it turns out moving in synchrony with other people releases endorphins and other kinds of happy bonding chemicals in our brains. It makes us feel good. It makes us feel bonded and trusting with each other. So there's lots of feedback. So it's not a surprise that even in, early childhood, you put on music that's got a, clear enough beat, kids start moving. My point is the building blocks of dance are there. They're natural. But it does not follow from that every kid will grow up a dancer.
Right.
But it does mean the building blocks are there. But it requires a cultural environment then to take those building blocks and to put them together in particular ways and to cultivate that. Or, to put it the other way, it takes special cultural environments to discourage dance from emerging. And it does happen, right? Some cultures don't like dance for various reasons. And if you're like, nope. Or if your music is arrhythmical, that would make dancing hard. Then you'll get other kinds of coordinated, synchronized movement probably, but we wouldn't call it dance because it's not to music. Well, I think that's analogous to religious behaviors, right? The building blocks are there, they're natural. How those building blocks get assembled is largely culturally contingent. But in part, that's actually, I think, a helpful perspective because not all of these things that we call religions actually are quite the same. And you and I
Hmm.
both know there are these weird marginal cases like, well, believing in ghosts, is that religious or not? Well,
Hmm.
what about divination
Hmm.
practices where you're trying to predict the future and stuff? Is that religious or not? I'm not sure. There are these funny marginal cases, right? Well, yeah,
Right.
because cultural environments have taken these pieces that were natural and assembled them in a slightly different way.
Hmm.
And or think of it like a menu. So, you've got all of your ingredients, but you can arrange those ingredients in lots of different ways.
Right.
But as much diversity as there is in food and eating, um, it's not infinite. It's still constrained by basic human psychology and our social psychology, how we interact with each other. Not just everything
Right.
is nutritious to us, not everything is delicious to us, not everything is easy to prepare, not everything is accessible, and so forth. So I think in some ways those might be better metaphors than language, because language, even though it does require a social input, right, to learn language and is strongly natural, it is the case that it's got a stronger inevitability about it. It's really
Hmm.
hard to make it go away. It's a little bit
Right.
easier, I think, to make certain kinds of religious beliefs to go away than it is language. So
Right.
there's I've changed my position just a little bit, but I'm still
Right.
strongly in the, oh yeah, this is pretty natural. And yes, if you put enough kids on an island who can stay alive and socialize with each other, you're probably going to get stuff that starts looking religious within at least one generation.
Right. Right.
I hope nobody does that experiment, though. That would be unethical.
Right.
Well,
So
hey,
so
this has
one
been a good conversation. You have one wrap up that you want to throw my way?
I actually have two if you're okay with that.
Okay, we'll see if my backside can handle it. Starting to get sore in my
So
chair.
one point that I want to raise is like, what do you think, what we learn from cognitive science, even though we are still discovering many more things, because this is a new field of cognitive science of religion. How does that map on to the Christian concept of sensus divinitatis and the Islamic concept of the fitra?
Yeah. Well, the Fitrah I don't know as well, of course. Sensus divinitatis there are different forms of this. Sensus divinitatis is the term that John Calvin made really popular, but we see other Christian thinkers have this basic idea, and we see a version in Islam that there's this sort of natural
Right.
receptivity to the divine. It's called sensus divinitatis, not sensus Dei.
Okay.
So, meaning it's a sense of the divine, but not sense of
Hmm.
God proper.
Hmm.
So, at least in many threads of Christianity, there's this idea of that, sometimes called a God-shaped vacuum, or this deep yearning, or in cognitive science of religion terms, a cognitive conceptual readiness to
Hmm.
believe in something like God, and then it's waiting for the right revelation to fill that space. And that's why it's not sensus Dei, because at least in Christian theology, there's still you got to tell me the particulars, because
Hmm.
humans, while we have this natural receptivity in us, because God wants to have that relationship with all of us, that we are also fallen. We are damaged by sin. We live in societies that are imperfect. And because
Right.
of that, he needs to meet us. He needs to reveal himself to us to fill in the picture and the details of that. So it's a little bit vague, a little bit inchoate is the fancy word, kind of sense of the divine that maybe has parameters like, I have this sense that there is someone behind all of this who gives life meaning. I have this
Hmm.
sense that there's design and purpose in the natural world and in events. I have this sense that I have certain obligations to if there is someone like that, I have certain obligations to that person, because that
Right.
person is worthy of my at least my allegiance, if not love, at least allegiance, and obedience and submission.
Right.
Those things might be in the background, but the particulars of it, well, who's the someone? Well, I'm not sure. And right, and in at least the Christian tradition, but I think there's some shared tradition here. It's for this reason that we have these, we make sense of these images like when Abram has an encounter with God. It's not like, oh, there's a God. It's like, who are you? Tell me more about you. I'm not a bit surprised that you're there. Oh, and what do you want from me? And Moses, we get the same kind of thing. All right, which God am I talking to here? Okay, all right, okay, I get you. Right, it's fill in the details of this God-shaped space that I already have. That maybe I recognize other kind of cultural candidates for that because of how I was grown up, but I need the details filled in. That's that sensus divinitatis. And the interesting thing about cognitive science of religion is it seems to provide some empirical evidence for just that kind of idea.
Right.
There are disagreements within Christianity about the particulars. Is the sensus divinitatis this kind of idea that we've got that's sort of in the background all of the time? Or is it the kind of thing that is kind of asleep and wakes up at peak moments, like when you climb to the top of a mountain and there's a beautiful sunrise, and then boom, your sensus divinitatis
Right.
goes, I'm awake.
Right.
God has done this. And so that's one dimension, is how active is it? How salient is it? How present is it in our thinking? Another dimension of we don't know is, and how particular is it? How specific? Does it build in, and there's only one God? I don't know. Or does it build in, I created the cosmos? Or does it just build in, I'm behind the design and purpose you see? Right? Those are slightly different kinds of views. And frankly, we don't know.
Right.
But my hope is that as cognitive science of religion moves forward, it actually provides us additional evidence that can be coupled with theological considerations to help form out both these doctrines, both in the Christian context and in the Islamic context, so that in both cases we can see progress around this seemingly shared kind of concept.
Right. So in your book, Born Believers, you had mentioned something like, one implication of this limitation for being born believers thesis that children are not born believers in specific religions or theological tradition. After public lectures arguing for a born believer thesis, I received numerous emails and found blogs from Muslims claiming that the born believer thesis is similar to the standard teachings in Islam. And then you say that the evidence of the data supports only the naturalness of belief in a mighty creator God, not that children are born to believe in Orthodox, Muslim, Jewish, or Christian theology, or any other for that matter. So when it comes to the fitra, the majority opinion regarding the theologians of the past also is the fitra is basically an original normative disposition, and not just for God, but for all of the natural, what you might call, like, for example, drawing from works of Robert Macaulay, you say that it's something like the path of least resistance, things that have automaticity and ease and stuff like that. So within our tradition, I think, yeah, we can have we have a difference of opinion, but I think majority of the opinion is regarding it being a natural disposition rather than being like a complete theological doctrine that's there within us. So wouldn't you then say that if
That
that is the
sounds
case,
pretty
then
close to the evidence at this point. Yeah.
okay,
Yeah, that's right.
okay, yeah.
If
And
if that's the view, and in the book when I was saying the evidence, what I meant is the evidence to date, because we might get new evidence that
right,
changes our view on this, that sharpens it up, that says, oh, there's more here than we realized.
right.
That
And
could happen.
one example I think you gave of this naturalness was, it's like was walking. Something like walking is like, you have given one example like this in the past. And what I found very similar was, for example, in the Quran itself, there is one very similar example given, which is like, where God is asking, then is one who walks upside down on his face better guided, or the one who walks upright on a straight path? In the sense implying that a person who is on on the natural disposition, like, with automaticity and ease, the path of least resistance, he's walking that way is better guided than the one who's walking on his face, for example. So
That's wonderful. Yeah.
wouldn't that fit with the current evidence that we have?
I think that's right. That's right. If that's the view that it is a disposition toward a belief in at least a creator God and some of these other types of features, certain kinds of moral obligations, not only to the God but to each other and so forth, that does seem to be part of our path of least resistance.
Okay.
And sounds right.
Okay. So one point, if you can summarize very briefly, if possible, one thing which on your like, one lecture you had, which had a very similar, very interesting question that was asked to you, which was like, that, now people are leaving religion. There's this trend of becoming secular. And you were explaining how even if people become secular, when you try to see socially what would go on with them, some would actually become more inclined towards some idea, some wouldn't, and that itself would create some concept of orthodoxy within them, and then after some time you're back with religion. So if you can very briefly summarize that, people cannot escape religion, and this, in terms of how we socially live, it generates automatically. You had given one example. If you can briefly give that again.
No, you probably remember it better than I do. It now this is mostly anecdotal,
Okay.
but there are lots of cases that seem to come up that I've heard about, and then we know some of these sociological studies of these new atheist societies that have even tried to build atheist churches.
Wow.
And and what they do is they mimic the same kinds of, okay, we get together once a week, we pick a day of the week, we sing songs, we hear a teaching. It's like, what are you doing here? Because there's a recognition that a lot of particularly the practices that many of the world's religious traditions have adopted, they're not arbitrary. They build communities of people. They build communities of trust. They do help focus us in terms of certain kinds of values that then we can live out in our day-to-day sort of way. And we seem to be drawn to, we've been focusing mostly on what draws us to God, but there are also things that draw us to ritual and ritualized practices. Like, well, fears of unseen hazards in our environment, as Pierre Léonard and Pascal Boyer have studied a lot, is the sort of, well, there are these things outside of our control that then we try to control through ritualized sorts of activities. And those often are aimed at gods or spirits or whomever can do stuff for us. But what does the atheist do? Well, they still feel this need to do certain kinds of rituals. A byproduct of those rituals is a sense of control, a sense of comfort, a sense of, well, we did something and we did it together, and now I'm with a community of people doing that. And so we are seeing that kind of dynamic. Another example that we hear about sometimes is how routinized and sort of ideological even some science labs get to be. Like, well, no, this is how the lab runs, and you can't deviate from that.
Wow.
So, well, why not? Well, this is how we do it. Like, whoa. Something funny is going on here. Political parties are famous for getting very ideological, and we're like, okay, but the reasoning behind it's not clear anymore. And we have our gods and we have our commitments. And those kinds of things just seem to be a part of the human condition. And so they get adapted in lots of different ways, even if somebody tries to jettison the metaphysical foundations. So it's not unlike what we were discussing earlier, where you've got all of those natural intuitions, that maturationally natural cognition, emotion, motivational centers that drive our thinking, our feeling, our acting, our morality, our judgments. And sometimes they're at odds with your theological system. Well, an atheist theological system is just a limiting case of that, right? It's just an extreme version. And
Wow.
yet they're going to feel some of the same little tugs of the, I still have to deal with all of the same challenges of life. I still have to deal with social interactions and so forth. I still want to somehow anticipate the future better. I still want my life to feel meaningful. I still want to ground my morality in something more stable than just, I don't like it. And so I'm going to start doing things that end up looking a whole lot like religious practices. And I'm going to have beliefs that are
Wow.
a whole lot like religious beliefs. Well, why not? That's the way humans have solved these problems for maybe
Right.
tens of thousands of years. It works for us. It's how we're psychologically and socially engineered. So it's really hard not to.
So, in like just a yes or no, is nationalism also something like that which we have created?
It can be that way. That's right.
Okay.
It can be a growth of that. It's a very peculiar one because nations have not long been part of human history.
Right.
So certain kinds of nationalism or certain kinds of totalitarian regimes that develop certain kinds of ideologies, right? They're going to try to push those same motivational and cognitive buttons that religions have done in the past in
Wow.
order to get going. That's why we say they can be personality cults, or why, yeah. So yes, I think. Sorry, you
Wow.
said yes, no, yes.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. I think it was a fascinating conversation with you. I got to learn so many new things.
Well, it was fun
Anything
to
that you're
talk.
working on? Anything new that you're working on that you would like to share with people, and then we can end the discussion.
Well, for those interested in cognitive science of religion, keep your eyes out for a discussion in the journal Religion, Brain, and Behavior. Claire White, Harvey Whitehouse, Pascal Boyer, Bob McCauley, Tom Lawson, and I wrote a Target article, and then a lot of people wrote responses to that, and then we're going to write a response back to them that's sort of on where is cognitive science of religion now after about 30 years of doing this stuff. So that might be of interest. For those who are more interested in, well, how does theology and the sciences go together? Those kinds of more topics. I have been working on some thoughts, some books about how we, regardless of our particular religious tradition, so I think it should apply, hopefully, for Muslims as well as Christians, and that is to a book that helps us reflect on how our worldview, how our faith should motivate and inform our doing of the sciences. So if you are a science-inclined person, it should help you think through, does the theology that I've adopted, does that help motivate me to become a scientist? And if so, how might it matter that I am doing science from my particular faith perspective? So that book I'm wrapping up, and hopefully
Wow.
that'll be coming out soon too.
Pretty interesting.
I think I'm calling it, How Does Your Faith Fuel Scientific Discovery, or something like that.
Wow. So I think it was like, it was an honor to have you on this platform. I really enjoyed the discussion. I hope you also enjoyed it.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
And we look forward maybe in future any opportunity that we get to maybe get you back on this platform. Inshallah ta'ala.
It would be nice to see you in person too at some point.
I would love to meet you in person, definitely.